Hello, we are in part 3 of the Flutter State Management series. In this part, we'll discuss provider and change notifier mechanism that gives us a way to decouple the business logic from the widget tree. The provider itself is a library or a package that uses inherited widget. So the inherited widget is the one which enables that targeted data passing to specific widgets so that only the required data is passed in and only part of the widget is rebuilt and without the need to rebuild the entire tree. So before we jump into the provider and how to use it in our NewsApp, let's look at the theory behind the inherited widget first. Here is an overview of the inherited widget. We have the widget tree on the left-hand side and the extracted out logic on the right-hand side. The logic here can handle the data store through network API calls, say to the NewsAPI endpoint, and also manage the local data through add, update, and delete operations. It also has the listener notified component, where the listener looks out for changes in the data and accordingly notifies the provider of those changes. So we have two communication channels between the provider and the logic out here. So you see the data is managed through this channel, which carries out the read and write operations. So it's two-way. And also the change notifications through which the notifications are sent by the logic to the provider. The provider here is the inherited widget, which is positioned at the root of the tree. So you can think of it as a bridge between the widget tree and the extracted out logic. So with the provider being the bridge and positioned at the root of the tree, any descendants or target widgets that are in need of data or changes to data can directly register to the provider and get access to the data. That way you don't have to pass in data to the intermediate widgets, which are grayed out here, like we did with the constructors in the part 1. Also, the communication is two-way because for the read, you get the data from the logic to the provider and back to the target widget. And for any updates to data, which is the write operation, it goes from the target widget to the provider and then to the business logic. Also, when the target widget registers to the provider, it gives information on whether it wants to be rebuilt automatically with any changes to data. So based on that, each time the provider receives a notification from the logic through this channel, it automatically rebuilds the target widget that is registered for that change. This is an efficient setup where only the targeted widgets are given the required data and only those widgets are rebuilt and not the entire widget tree. Also, with the business logic separated out, the UI can focus more on the presentation itself with minimal or no business logic at all. Another advantage is with the app testing, because the business logic is in a separate component now, you can do better testing, which may be more complicated. It is closely integrated with the UI in the widgets. Next, let's see how we can use the provider, which internally uses the inherited widget in our NewsApp. We are in Visual Studio Code again with the NewsApp home widget, which is the main screen on app launch. So right now, the network calls to the NewsAPI endpoint are being done within the NewsApp home widget itself. So if you go to the get new stream method, that's where we are doing the API call to the HTTP request and getting back the response, extracting the data into a map and returning it as a feature. So which is then used in the build method when rendering the actual widget tree, which is going to get the UI. So once the data is returned, we are then passing it on to the NewsGrid widget. So what we're passing in is the list of articles that are to be displayed in the grid. But if you think about it, the NewsApp home, the widget itself doesn't need this data. So to have a more cleaner code, we can avoid passing it in as an argument in the constructor. So this is one place provider can help us in just getting access to the data within the NewsGrid widget itself. So this is one area. Then if you go to the NewsGrid here, are you getting in the article list to the constructor. And then if you see internally, it renders the actual item in NewsGrid item widget. So to which again all the required data is passed on, like article URL, image URL, what date it was published, etc. So again, the NewsGrid itself, it doesn't need the entire article data. The actual widget that needs it is the NewsGrid item. So this is another fix that the provider can help us in allowing NewsGrid item to subscribe to a provider and then get access to the data that it needs. So first improvement over previous code base would be to fix the data that's passed in through the constructors and to limit the amount of data that's needed by each widget. So first we need to model the data that is needed by each article. So that way the NewsGrid item could get access to the data like in a single instance of a data model with all these attributes, article URL, and so on, and then create the extracted logic, which has the data store and the listener notifier mechanism, like we discussed in the overview. Those are the two things we need to create first before we can create the provider instance to be at like somewhere at the top of the widget tree from which the descendants can access the data. Let's create a folder named models in the source directory where we can hold the model for the NewsGrid item data. Within the models folder, we'll create the file for the news item data. This will be a normal class, not a widget. It is just to hold the data. So the convention would still be the same. So let's go to NewsGrid item where it accesses all the data attributes. So I could just copy paste this part. Same way we'll copy the constructor as well. We'll just change the name to the name of this class. Because the required annotation, it's part of Flutter, so we have to import the foundation ... from the Flutter package. But still, this is not a widget. So the errors are gone. We're fine. Let's save this. Make the changes in NewsGrid item ... We could probably create a map so that uniquely identifies the object as the key. So we could have title. So we could use title as the key and then have the object as the value. That could be what the NewsGrid gets from the provider, and then the key could be passed on by the NewsGrid to the NewsGrid item, which it in turn can use to fetch the actual data object specific to that article within the NewsGrid item, because it's just one item and it only needs the data for that specific item based on the title. However, in the NewsGrid, if you think about it, you don't need the entire data. So what you need is the list of the keys. So in other words, list of the titles of the articles. That kind of gives us the blueprint for what we could have in the extracted logic, like the data store and the ChangeNotifier instance. Let's work on the ChangeNotifier and the data store, and then we'll come back and fix these widgets. Let's create another folder. Let's call it providers, because a provider would essentially be having an instance of the data store and ChangeNotifier component. Things will get more clear once we get into the details with the code and implementation. In the providers, we'll create a file for the provider. Let's call it NewsProvider. So the data store, since it has to hold some data, just like we're holding data in the model through a class, this will also be a class. So that accomplishes the data store part. And for the notifier listener part, we'll be using a mixin called ChangeNotifier. So its job is to look for changes in the data that is maintained in the class, and we'll have a special method called notify listeners that could be used to notify the changes to the actual provider. Again, it will be a normal class. Let's call it NewsProvider. And the way to add a mixin. So mixin, it's also another class. It's just that when you add it to a class, you're adding some capability or functionality that's not originally part of that class. So here we're adding the mechanism of listening to changes and notifying those changes through that mixin. So you see there seems to be an error with the change notifier. So if you hover over it, go to the quick fix. So it again needs the foundation.dot because that's implemented as the Flutter package. So let's import that. Now the error is gone and we have what we need. So here, let's first create a method to make that API call. So we would be shifting that logic from the NewsApp home widget to this provider. So let's go to NewsApp home. We'll copy the logic for the HTTP calls from in here. We'll only copy the part where the HTTP request is made. We'll just with this, put it in the provider, but we'll need the URL from the NewsApp home. In the NewsApp home, we still get which stream was selected from the side drawer. So we have the news stream and the stream name here. We'll just pass it on to the method in the provider. So let's create a method. Let's name it refresh new stream. So it will be returning a future, but the void because no data will be returned back. It will be maintained in here. Because we need the URL, we'll be getting as an input argument from the NewsApp home. Let's put the code inside the method. Need to have the async keyword. Here's the name, new stream URL. Because we need access to the NewsAPI key, we'll have to import that environment.dot as well. And also the HTTP package. Now we need that map between the title and the actual object to be maintained in the provider. So let's declare another variable here. Since we created the model, news item model, so that will be the value in the map. So we need to import that. Let's name it title to news item map. We're initializing it with an empty map. So the entries would be key value pairs. So with that, we then need to extract the data after we get the response. Let's go back to NewsApp home and extract this part of the code. Here the extraction is done from the body. Now let's store the data as response data. So now we'll have to extract the articles from the response data, just like we did in the NewsApp home. So here we're passing it on to the NewsGrid by extracting it from the articles. We won't need the data part though, because here we're doing it in a future builder and we're getting it from a snapshot. So, but we're not going to have that snapshot in the provider. So we directly access the articles and then generate that map with the titles of articles as keys and giving all the data to that model instances. Let's go to the provider. And in here, we'll access the articles directly from the response data. It is a list, so we have a method called map, which can work on an iterable. So iterables are nothing but something that has multiple items of a given type, like a collection. So list, it's an iterable, map is an iterable, set is an iterable. Let's save it in an instance of a list so that we can work with the map method easily. Now we can use the map method on the article list and transform the data into a map. So as you can see, the map, it takes in a function. We'll get each object in the list as an input for that method automatically, and then we can work on the data to create our map. We have an anonymous function here, takes in an entry, so article, and now we can work on that article. What we want in return is an instance of news item model. So we're going to extract all the data from the input article here and transfer the data to that model instance. So we have all the attributes like we had in the NewsGrid item widget. Just like we pass them on in the NewsGrid widget, we can copy that logic in here. Go to NewsGrid. So this is what we need. Let's just copy paste that. So we don't need the IDX because the map function, it works on all the entries in the list, and with each item you get directly access to the data you need. So you don't need the IDX here. In Visual Studio Code, you also have a way to simultaneously work on multiple places in the file by selecting the Alt key and then clicking on the place that you want to work on next simultaneously. So you see you have a cursor blinking in two places. So same could be scaled to multiple places. See all those instances. So now you can just select them simultaneously and just delete it. And next we need to remove the list from an article list because what we have as input is the article. So same way, multiple places. And all the errors are gone. And what you get back from the map is also an iterable. So we want to convert that to list. So here, if you do dot and slash, so you have the option of converting it to a list. So we'll do that. So once you have the list, now you can create the map with all the titles as keys and the news item model instances as the value. So because you want a single map as an output with all the entries as part of that map, we have another method called fold, which takes a collection or an iterable and consolidates that into a single entry. So we'll use .fold for that. So you have to give an initial value. So in our case, we want a map, so we can give it an empty map as an initial value. Next, you have a function that takes the previous value of the map. So here we have the list. Each list entry is again passed in as the element. So it uses both of those values to create the next map, like the consolidated one. So we can give it a name. And the element would be the news item model instance. So let's name it that. So the output should also be another map, which is a consolidated one. So again, the flower brackets. Only now you have to populate this with whatever were the previous values until this point, and then add this entry as a new entry. So we can use this spread operator for that to kind of take the previous instance of the map, then unzip it to get access to the key value pairs in the map, and then make it part of this new map. The way to do that is with the three dots and then the previous map instance. Now the new instance. So we want the title as the key, then the actual instance as the value. The errors are gone, and we need to save it in our local copy, what we have right here. That is what we're maintaining with each new stream refresh. We're fetching it from the NewsAPI endpoint, extracting all the data, creating a map, then in turn generating the final map with the title as key and the model instances as values. This can now be used to supply the needed list of titles to the NewsGrid. We'll add a get method. It will be a list of strings. get. So that is the way to declare a get method. So just give get and the name of the get method. And you just can return the keys in the map that you created. However, keys returns unenterable, so we can make the type more explicit by using the as keyword. So the NewsGrid widget will use this method to get access to all the titles of the articles, which it can pass on to each of the grid items. But in the NewsGrid item, we need access to the explicit data. So for that, we need another method which takes the title and then gives the actual value in the map, which is the model instance. This way, you're also minimizing the amount of data that you need to pass on from NewsGrid to the NewsGrid item. It'll be more clear once we get to the actual code. Now let's create the method. So it returns item of type newsItemModel and takes the title as input. So we'll just name that get model data by title. Now we just return the item model based on the input title. So let's save it. And this is pretty much what we need for the provider. We named it provider, but it is actually the extracted out logic, the data store plus the notifier and the listener. For the notifier and the listener part, once we're done with the creation of the map here, we need to notify any subscribers in the widget tree so that they could take appropriate action, like re-rendering any child widget. So the method to do that is notify listeners. So without this, even though there is a change, there won't be any notification to subscribers in the widget tree, and you won't see any change in the UI. So it's important to have this method, like call to this method, each time there is a change in the data. We're done with the extracted component with the logic for the data store and the listener notifier. So now in order for the widgets in the widget tree to get access to these methods and access the data, we need to have the provider in the widget tree with the provider package. So let's work on that next. Okay, we're in pub.dev, so where we have all the dot packages. So we want the provider package, provider. Let's just click on the link. So it's one of the favorite packages for Flutter. And if we go to the installing page, so this is how we can install it in our app by including the dependency provider, that line of code in pubspec.yaml. And with that, we also need to run the flutter pub-get command to actually do the installation. But with Visual Studio Code, it's done automatically, so you don't have to worry about that. And the way to actually use the package in our code is with this line of code, the import. First, let's just copy this line of code, paste it in pubspec.yaml. So when we save it, the Visual Studio Code just runs that command. The provider package is now installed, so let's use it in our code. First, we need to actually create an instance of the provider in our widget tree. The rule of thumb is to place the provider instance above the widget that is in need of some data that it can get from that instance. So we'll place the provider at the root of the widget tree so that all the descendants can easily access whatever data they need from the news provider that we created. So let's go to main.dart. There we have the material app, which is the current root of the widget tree. So we can place the provider instance above that material app. So the way to do that is by refactoring the code, the Control Shift and R. So you have different options. We'll wrap it with the widget. So the name of the widget or the provider, which is also a widget, is ChangeNotifierProvider. As the name suggests, this has been designed to work specifically with the Change Notifier mixin that we used in the NewsProvider. It's showing that red wavy line, which indicates an error. because we haven't imported the provider dot. So let's do that. We'll also need access to the news provider, so we'll have to import that from the providers folder too. Now you see a yellow line, so that indicates a warning. So if we go there, it says that the parameter create is required. So what that does is it creates that instance of the news provider that we need. So that is the extracted out logic with the data store and the listener notifier instance. So if we check the signature for the create, it's a function that takes in something of type build context and returns something of type change notifier. So in our case, this is the news provider. So let's create that. So with that create parameter, what we have done is we have established a communication between the extracted out logic and the change notify provider, which is the actual provider. So hope that clears things up, because both the named provider, but the actual provider is this widget, change notify provider, and this is the component, like the business logic, that's extracted out. Now with change notify provider in place at the root of the widget tree, the descendants can register for any data that they need or changes to the data that happened within news provider. Let's start with the NewsApp home first. Previously, the getNewsStream method had the logic to make the network call to the NewsAPI endpoint and create that list of articles. So since we have moved that to news provider, you now have to subscribe to the news provider and call that refresh newsstream method. The way to do that is provider dot of context. You also have to mention which provider you want to register to. So right now we just have one provider, which is the news provider. So we need to give that as the type for the off. So it is typed. Give it in those brackets. So it shows the errors because we haven't imported the provider.dot and the news provider. So let's do that. We can also clean up the previous imports on the HTTP and other files which were needed for the network calls. The errors are gone, and with this code we get access to the news provider instance. That's because this provider.off method finds it at the root and then gets access to it. So that satisfies the rule of thumb that we talked about. Now we can make a call to that refresh newsstream method. As you can see, it's listed right here. And we also need to give the URL so that it can make the required network call. So because this returns a future, so we need to have the await, since this is a method using futures with the async. Also, we need to change the return type because it's going to be void. It's not going to get back any data. So let's just get rid of this line of code as well, because we're not using it. And you can get rid of the return as well, because if the return type is void, you don't have to explicitly give return there. That's pretty much the code change that you need to register to a provider and make calls to some methods and get access to data. So another thing about the provider is whether it's interested in changes to data or not. Since we're getting void as the return type, we don't need to listen for any changes here. The way to refrain from listening to changes is with the listen parameter that's inside the off method. So it's a boolean, so we give that as false. Or if you're interested in changes to data so that the provider can rebuild the widget with each change, then you just remove this listen parameter. The default is true. Let's format it and save it. So this is one place in the code where we can use the provider to do the initial call to the NewsAPI endpoint. Next place is the NewsGrid widget. So here with the older code, we're passing in the list of articles, but now we don't have to do that because we have a separate method in NewsProvider to get the list of articles that could be used in NewsGrid. Let's remove the input argument here. We need to change the method signature though. See that yellow line is complaining about the argument that it's expecting. Save it. Now we can go to NewsGrid and fix the code. So here we no longer need the input argument. So we can just get rid of all of the code. We'll use the provider instance within the build method itself. So we'll go here, write the same code. We'll again have to import the provider.dot and the news provider as well. Servers are gone again, and when we do the dot, we have the titleList method, which is the get method through which we can access the list of titles. So let's save it in a variable of type list string. We can just give final, indicating that the data won't change, and it will be able to infer the type from what it gets in title list. Now we can use article titles within the NewsGrid widget. So in the grid view builder, we'll just give all those list of article titles as input to each of the NewsGrid items. So another fix here would be with the NewsGrid item widget. So right now we're passing in entire data to the NewsGrid item, but since we've created another method to access data based on the title, we can use that in NewsGrid item and just pass on the title here. So you can just get rid of all of these attributes. Let's just keep the title. I mean, we don't need the title anymore because what you have is the title. So we'll just pass it in. Those are all the changes in NewsGrid widget. So let's go to NewsGrid item to make the other change. Again, in NewsGrid item, we can get rid of all the attributes apart from the title. Again, in the build method here, we'll use the provider instance. I need to import the provider and news provider as well. We'll use get model data by title method, and we have to pass in the title that we're getting is input, this attribute right here. Return type is NewsAPI model, which is the model that we created to store the data needed by each item. So we'll just save that. Let's name it article data. We can use article data to populate the information in the UI. So here, instead of image URL, it will be article data dot image URL. Same way, we'll replace all the other instances in the widget with the data from the object. To change the launch article method as well, because it expects the article URL, and now we have to pass that in from the object. So we will be getting it as input. And in the call here, onTap expects a function that takes in no arguments and returns a void. So we need to change the method signature, essentially add a wrapper around it to match the expected function type. And we just call it. That completes all the code changes to integrate the provider into our app. There is also the option to not subscribe to changes in data. by passing in another parameter to the off method, listen. It's a boolean, so we'll just give false. Save it. For NewsGrid item widget, it makes sense not to listen to changes in data because we're using grid view builder, and each time an item or the NewsGrid item gets into the viewport and out of the viewport, it's created and destroyed. So during that life cycle, the data doesn't change. So once it gets input data, it stays that way. That completes all the changes to integrate the provider into our app. So let's install it on the emulator. It will take some time, so I'll be back once it's done. The app is now installed, but you see the loading spinner, it's continuous. And also we see the network calls being made constantly. So we have an infinite loop here. That's because if we go to the NewsApp home widget, we have the call to the refresh new stream method in get new stream method. But if we go to the provider, there it has the notify listeners call in the refresh new stream. So each time the build happens in the NewsApp home widget, it makes a call to the get new stream method in the future builder. That in turn gets the notification from the provider, and then again provider rebuilds it. So this goes on in a cycle, leading to an infinite loop of making the network calls and rebuilding the widget again and again. We only want the data the first time the widget is built. So we have to make a distinction between first call and the successive calls done based on that notification from the news provider. So we need to have a flag in place, like the first load. It'll be a boolean. Let's add that. So this will be true the first time the widget is built. So we'll add the condition here. If it's the first load, you make the call to the provider method. If not, just don't do it. We also need to reset the flag because once the call is made for the first load, we don't have to make calls in the successive invocations. So we'll just set it to false. Also, once we get the data, we don't have to listen for any changes to the data because we're getting a void in return. So we could add that listen parameter and set it to false. So let's restart the app. So as you can see, after the code change and restarting the app, so the network call is made just once. So the infinite loop is fixed, but we have a new error. So let's take a look at that error. So it says there is an incompatibility with the list of titles that we're getting from the provider in the NewsGrid. So let's get to that line of code. It's right there where we're making the call to titleList. So if you go to the provider and to the titleList method, so here the return type of the keys is an iterable of type string. Even though we're doing a cast, it's not working. So what we need to do is we have to convert the iterable to a list. So then we won't be needing that typecast. Here, dot to list. So here it shows some kind of warning. It says it's an unnecessary cast. So we can just remove that dot. It seems fine. That should fix the error. So let's restart the app again. And you see now we're able to get the display in the app with the different items. So the code fixed work. Let's add some error handling as well with the network API calls with the try catch blocks and the dot then when needed. So let's get back to the provider. So in here we're making the call to the NewsAPI endpoint. Let's put that in a try catch block. It's better to keep minimal code in the try block so that we catch targeted exceptions. So here we specifically want to handle any errors with the network API calls made to NewsAPI endpoint. So we'll place just that code in the try catch block, the try block. And if there are any exceptions, we'll catch it in the catch block. Let's name it exception. And if there is an exception, we just throw it back to the client, which will be one of the widgets in the widget tree. So now, only when there is no exception when running the network call, the rest of the code in the method will get executed. So if at all there is an exception, it will be thrown to the client, and this part of the code won't get executed. So that is the way to handle any hiccups in the app execution. Just like we have the handling here, we need to have appropriate handling in the widget registered to this provider as well. Let's save this and go to the NewsApp home widget. So here, now because the refresh new stream has the chance of throwing an exception, we need to be able to catch it in the NewsApp home widget. So we'll put it in try block, and then the catch block. For now, we'll just print it out to the console. So print. Also, we're not storing the response after the request in the news provider. So in the refresh new stream method, we need to store whatever response we get in the get response variable here. So that way, once the call is done, it can be used down here to extract the data from the body and create that map between title and the data. Save it and restart the app. So it seems to be working fine. With respect to the data, right now we're getting it just once from the NewsAPI endpoint when the NewsApp home widget is built. And after that, we're not refreshing the data even if the data is updated on the NewsAPI endpoint. So we need to give the user an option to be able to refresh the data so that you give them more control on when they want to see new content, and it can be easy with respect to the data usage and also the battery. So let's work on that next to add the option of refreshing the content. We'll go back to NewsApp home widget, and in the build method, you can wrap the future builder with another widget, RefreshIndicator. So again, refactoring the code with Ctrl+Shift+R, wrap it with another widget. RefreshIndicator says that it needs the onRefresh method. When you make an attempt to refresh, what should be the callback or what needs to be done for the data to be refreshed. So we'll again make the call to the getNewStream method, but now when the user chooses to refresh the data. So on refresh, again it's a method that takes no arguments and returns a future void that matches the method that we have right now to make the API call. So the getNewStream method. So we'll just add that. Go back to the emulator again. Now to actually refresh the data, we can pull down on the screen. So if we just click and pull down, see you have that circling indicator. So when you release it, it will refresh it. Right now we're not making another API call because we have set a flag to only make that call for the first build. But now we have to make changes so that when the user chooses to refresh the data, we make another API call. So let's go back to the code. So let's add another flag, just like isFirstLoad, to indicate that we have a refresh request from the user. So it will also be a bool. Let's name it refresh request. Initially it will be false because it is only made when the user chooses to. Now in the getNewStream method, we can make the call when either it's a first load or when we have a request from the user. So we'll have an OR condition here and now add the flag indicating the request for the refresh. Just like we're setting isFirstLoad to false after the request is made, we'll set it to false once the request is done for the refresh as well. Let's save it. The catch here is the initial value of isRefresh request is false, and for the request to be made, it has to be true. So the place to set it to true would be when you actually pull down to do the refresh, so which is right here for the on refresh. So we need to have more code in the method apart from making the call to get new stream. So let's add a wrapper around that. So in here we can set is refresh request to true when you're actually making that refresh by pulling down on the app screen. And here we just make the call to the get new stream method. So now the get new stream method will be able to make the call because we're setting the flag to true before the call is made to the method. Let's add the async keyword since get new stream returns the future void. So let's save it, pull up the emulator again. Now when we try out refreshing the content by pulling down, see here another request is made to the NewsAPI endpoint, but visually you're not able to see that in the app. So let's fix that by adding circular progress indicator based on the refresh flag. So when you're doing the refresh, the app is loading. So we have a flag for that. Is loading. Initially it is false. So in the get new stream method, when we are about to make the network call, we can set the is loading flag to true because it will take some time for the future to complete and get the data back. That is the time when it is loading. And when we set the is loading to true, we want the app to rebuild and show the circular progress indicator. So we have to put it in a set state method. We set is loading to true here. And when the request is done, we set is loading to false. So that way we can use that is loading flag in the build method to render that circular progress indicator. We could add the other two flags inside the method as well because they also represent state. And now in here, we add that progress indicator based on the loading state. If it is loading, have the circular progress indicator. If not, just add the normal widget like the refresh indicator or the future builder based on what you're doing in the app. Okay, let's reformat it. Alt Shift and F and save it. Let's restart the app and see how it looks in the emulator. Yeah, it seems to render fine, but one fix is we can center the circular progress indicator here. So we'll wrap it in another widget. So refactor it and wrap it with the center. Let's save it again. Restart the app. It seems to load fine. Now let's test the refresh. So now you see the loading spinner. It's making another network API call and it's loading the content. Because there is no update in data on the NewsAPI servers, you're not seeing new content. It's just the same content that you're getting back in the network API call. Let's say once the data is updated and you do the refresh, then you will then see the fresh content. Next, let's talk about extension methods. They're another way to connect to the provider from within a child widget. The catch is they can be used only within the build method along with the build context and not in methods outside the build. Let's go to NewsApp Home. Here we're using the getNewStream method within which we have the provider.offContext.notation. So for the extension methods, we won't be able to do this because it's in a method outside the build in an isolated function. So this is one limitation with the extension methods. So if we go to the other widgets like the NewsGrid, we're using the provider within the build method. So this could be one place where we can choose between the provider.off notation or the extension methods. Let's try the extension method here. Let's comment this part out and redeclare it. Like I mentioned, the extension methods have to be used with the build context in the build method. So we'll be using the context here. Because we're going to use the provider.off and we are registered for any changes to the data. So we can use the .watch method, which is one of the extension methods. Just hover Basically, it looks up the widget tree to find an instance of that given provider, and then it returns that provider. So the documentation tells you the same. So obtain a value from the nearest ancestor provider, type T, and subscribe to the provider. So we'll be using the news provider here. Now we have access to that instance positioned at the root of the widget tree. And if we do dot, we get the same list of methods again, like we got for the provider.offContext notation. So we'll again use the title list, just like we used in the commented outline here. Let's format it, save it, and pull up the emulator to see how it is. Let's restart the app. It seems to be rendering fine. I can just scroll and see. So the code change works without any issues. So the .watch method, by default, it just subscribes to any changes in the data so that the provider could rebuild this widget. So it's like the default provider.offContext that notation. Just like we have the option of setting the listen to false in the provider.off notation, we have another method .read for the extension method, which does the same. It just gets access to the data and doesn't listen to any changes. Just like .watch, we have .read. So if we hover, so just like it's given in the documentation, obtain a value from the nearest ancestor provider of type T. So it will not make widget rebuild when the value changes. So that's essentially setting the listen value to false when done with the provider.offContext. However, when we try to use the read, it seems to be throwing some errors and suggesting us to use watch instead, or another method select. So let's save it, see what we get in the console. Let's restart it. You see, there seems to be an error. So if we take a look at it, so it says try to use the read method inside either a build or the update callback of a provider. And it suggests to use either the .watch or the .select method. So even though we have the .read method, they're suggesting us to use other options in the extension methods. So we'll just stick with the .watch for now. As we go along, we'll find another use case for the .select method. For now, let's just stick with the .watch. Also, it's possible to have multiple providers in a single application. Right now, we are just using NewsProvider. So to demonstrate the use of multiple providers, let's capture the scroll position on the app viewport. So just like we scroll here, we want to capture where the pointer for the scroll is at and maintain that in a separate provider so that other widgets in the widget tree could subscribe and get access to the data and do what's needed within those widgets. Let's create another provider for that, and we'll need another widget to capture the scroll position. So since the scrolling is done for items in the NewsGrid, which is a grid view builder, we'll have to capture the position in that widget. So let's get back to Visual Studio Code and to the NewsGrid widget right here. In the grid view builder, we'll wrap it with another widget. So let's refactor it. So Ctrl+Shift+R, wrap it with the widget. So the name of the widget is Notifier Listener. So its job is to listen to any notifications, which in our case would be the scroll notifications, like change in its position. Let's rename the widget. It's a notification listener. So if we hover, we have a method for on notification. So this is what we'll be using to capture the scroll position and then pass it on to the provider. So let's get started with it. So we'll have an anonymous method that takes a notification as input. Let's name it notification. And it should return something of type bool. So for now, let's return bool false. So now we can check the type of the notification to see if it's a scroll notification or not, and then accordingly take some action. If Let's do a control space so that we know what are the different options with the scroll word in it. What we need is a notification. So here we see scroll end notification, but what we want is a scroll update. Go a little further down and we have the scroll update notification here. Get access to the scroll position. So if we do notification dot, we have the scroll delta. So that basically gives you access to the position. And the type is double, the distance by which the scrollable was scrolled in logical pixels. So let's just print it for now and return true. And now let's restart the app and pull up the emulator. The app is all loaded up, so let's now scroll and see if we're able to capture the position through the notification. So you see, you have those decimal values there. That is like the value by which, or the logical pixels by which the scroll was done on the viewport. So when we scroll up, we have a positive value, and when we scroll down, we have a negative value there. Based on the captured value, whether it's a positive or a negative value, it can indicate the direction of the scroll and also the displacement, like how big or small the value is. It can show whether the user is scrolling too quick or too slow, or in other words, how attentive or how interesting the articles are to the user. So first, we'll work on creating a provider to capture the scroll position, just that value. So let's resume coding. Let's create another file in the providers. Let's name it as ScrollPositionProvider. Just like the Newsprovider, it will also have the mixin of ChangeNotifier, and it will be another normal class to hold the data. Let's name it ScrollPositionProvider. We'll hold the scroll position of type double. Now we need two methods, one to get the value from the NewsGrid widget and store it in here, and then a get method so that any subscribed methods or widgets can get access to that stored position. So for the set method, we just give the set keyword and the name. Let's name it set scroll position, and we take the input argument, which is the scroll position. In this method, we just set the local variable, which is the scroll position, with the input value. That's it for the set method. And for the get method, we'll just return the stored scroll position. So that is a convention for the get, just a return type, get word, name, and then the return, just like we did in the Newsprovider. So let's save it. It automatically imported the Cupertino, but we'll just name it Foundation. Since we're not using iOS, we won't be needing Cupertino. Let's save it. Just like the Newsprovider was placed at the root of the widget tree, we need to place ScrollPositionProvider as well at the root, so that any child widgets could subscribe and get access to the scroll position. So we have another widget for that to handle multiple providers. Let's go to main.dat. So here, when we had just one provider, we could directly put it above the material app. But since we have more than one provider, we have to use MultiProvider. That is another widget that gives us a way to handle multiple providers in a single app. Let's change the name, MultiProvider. So it gives us a warning. We hover and scroll down. So it says the parameter providers is required. So if we go up again and look at the signature, so we have a provider's parameter. So its type is a list and single child widget, essentially the providers that we have. So let's go here, new providers, and we'll just have a list of providers. It will be Change Notifier providers in both the cases. and we'll just copy paste that. So we can just copy and paste that for our second instance, which is the new provider for the scroll. We need to import that because it's not currently visible. So all the errors are gone, and let's just format it, Shift and F. So this is the way to have multiple providers within a single app and position them at the root of the widget tree. Now with all the required providers placed at the root, now we can subscribe to the scroll position provider and get access to the scroll position. Save it and go to the NewsApp home widget. Let's restart the app because we've made some major change, and pull up the emulator. For now, just to test the code, let's just subscribe to the scroll position provider and display the value right up there on the app bar. Let's get back to Visual Studio Code. We are in NewsApp home widget, so let's create an actions in the title bar or the app bar. Actions is a list of widgets, so we'll add a text widget to display the scroll position each time there's a change and we get it from the scroll position provider. Let's create an array and add a text widget in it. Also, let's wrap the text widget inside a circle avatar widget. Let's give some background color, maybe indigo. Now let's register to the scroll position provider so that we can get access to the scroll position. In the build method, we can use another extension method, .select, to register to the scroll position provider. Just like the watch method, we'll have select. So select, it takes a function. The input is the provider instance, and the return type is specific value that's part of the provider. So in our case, that would be the scroll position, which is of type double. It shows error because we haven't imported the provider yet. So let's fix that. The error is fixed. Now we can get the scroll position. So we have the fetch scroll position method here. So we're fetching the scroll position here, but we haven't used the set method, which actually populates the scroll position for the provider. That would have to be done in the NewsGrid, where we capture the scroll position. So let's go to NewsGrid. Here we are just printing the scroll position right now. So what we need to do is we have to pass it on to the set method, the scroll position provider. So for that, we'll have to register the NewsGrid widget as well to communicate with the scroll position provider. Let's import that first. Now in the build method, instead of printing out the scroll position, we can now call the set method in the provider and pass on the data to it. Let's use the provider.off notation and make the call to the set method, which is the store scroll position. The way to set with the set method is by using an equal and then just giving the value that you want that to be set to. So which in our case is the notification scroll delta. Now this might look odd, but this is how we work with the set methods. Also, because it is a set method, we are updating some value, so we don't have to listen to any changes in the data, because this is the source of the change. So we can use the listen parameter and set it to false. So that completes the cycle. We are setting the value of the scroll position in the NewsGrid widget, and in the NewsApp home widget, we are accessing that scroll position right here. So we have the value being returned here by the select method, so we can store it in a variable. Now we can use the current scroll position to be displayed in the text widget. It's complaining because the type is double, but text it expects a string as an input data. So let's convert that to string. Let's use toString as fixed. That gives you a way to fix the number of digits after the decimal. That helps with the presentation in the UI. Let's limit to 2. That fixes the errors. Also, let's give it a style. We can give a white color for better visibility. That completes the code changes that we need to access the scroll position and display it in the UI in real time. Let's restart the app and pull up the emulator. See, we have the initial value being displayed here with 0. Let's test it by scrolling and see if that's getting updated in the app bar here. So we have the value being printed out here, so it's able to gather the value, but you don't see that getting updated in the UI. So let's go back to the scroll position provider and see what the issue might be. So in the scroll position provider, you see in the set method, which updates the scroll position here, we don't have a call to notify listeners. That's the reason we're not able to see an updated value in the UI. Let's just paste it here. Now it will be able to notify the provider at the root of the widget tree and accordingly rebuild the UI. So let's restart it again. It's all loaded and we have the default value of 0 for the scroll position. Let's try that now. Now you see we have that getting updated, and also you see that the app is getting reloaded. That's because we have the NewsApp home widget subscribed to 2 providers now. One is the NewsProvider for the actual news stream feed, and also the scroll position from the ScrollPositionProvider. So each time the scroll position is updated, you have the notify listeners and then the widget being rebuilt by the provider at the root. So that's a problem. We don't want that news stream getting rebuilt each time we scroll the app. We go to the NewsApp home widget. We just want the news stream to be updated once, and we want the news stream to stay put each time we do the scrolling. So a fix would be extracting out this widget in the actions into a separate file, a separate widget, so that the effect is localized to that particular widget of data getting updated. So that way, the NewsApp home widget won't get affected with the scroll action from the user. So let's create a new file and extract out this widget into a separate one. Let's name it scroll direction indicator. It will be a stateful widget because we want it to be updated with the change in the scroll position. So let's import the material.dart file. Let's name it scroll direction indicator. And we need to override the create state method. Now let's create the state class that's associated with this widget. Now let's override the build method. We can now copy paste the widget from the NewsApp home widget. We can also move the part of the code that registers to the scroll position provider and gets the scroll position. And the import as well. Let's import the new widget in the NewsApp home. We can now use that widget in the actions. We also need to import the provider package in the scroll direction indicator. So that's why you have this error with the select. So the errors are gone. Let's save it and restart the app. Let's try the scrolling again. Now we have the scroll position getting updated in the app bar without the app being rebuilt over and over. That's because the effect is now localized to the scroll direction indicator widget, which only has that text being displayed in a circle avatar. So this is clearly a better state management where only targeted widget is getting access to the data and the rest of the widget tree is not getting affected with that rebuild done by the provider. Next, let's work on using this scroll position information in indicating the direction of the scroll, like with an arrow icon, like upward or downward, and also display some message on each news item on how fast or slow the user is scrolling the app. For that, we can have another dedicated provider which can get the scroll position from the scroll position provider and then give appropriate information on the styling and other things to be rendered in the widgets. Let's get back to Visual Studio Code. To speed things up, I've created the other provider because it involves styling of certain icons, colors, and etc. based on the scroll position. Let's create a new provider. Let's name it ScrollAttributesProvider. I'll just paste the code. Might have to rename the classes and the methods though. So let's name it ScrollAttributesProvider. Again, it has the ChangeNotifier mixin, and let's name the methods and then I'll go over what's happening in the code. Save it. I'll just go over the code now within the provider. So we basically have a map that has all the information on different attributes. So we're going to have like the direction of the scroll indicated by an icon, essentially an arrow upward or downward, and also some message on the news item, like based on the speed the user is scrolling. So you also have some colors that change with the direction and also the speed, and all of that is put inside the map. In the set method, store scroll position attributes, getting the double, the scroll position as input, it's absolute, and based on that we're seeing what is the value of the scroll position. Like if it is like 10, doesn't matter if it is upward or downward, have the scroll attributes being set with the colors, message for the speed, and the icon. The same way if it is in the range of 0 to 20, then you have a different setting for the colors and all, and so on. So we also have the upward direction based on the scroll position, whether it's greater than 0 or not. And also we're setting some sizes for the icons and the text. So again, we notify listeners once the attributes are updated based on the input scroll position. Then we have the get method where we fetch all those attributes, which is the map, and then use that in the widget to render the appropriate content. Now that we have a new provider in place, we need to go back to the main.data again and add an entry in the MultiProvider. So this will be a different type of provider called a proxy provider because it needs the input scroll position and it should get it from the scroll position provider. That means it is a provider that is dependent on another provider for the input data. So the name of the provider is ChangeNotifierProxyProvider. As you can see, you have multiple instances of the same provider, like the default 0, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So those are basically the dependencies, like how many providers this proxy provider can be dependent on. So here we are only dependent on one, which is the scroll position provider. So let's say it is dependent on the news provider as well. Then we can use a proxy provider 2, which allows 2 dependencies, and so on. So let's select the default one, which is just one. So it expects a create and an update. So just like we had the create here for the change notifier, we'll need an instance of that in the create, and also how to update based on the input from another provider. Also, like the name suggests, ChangeNotifierProxyProvider. This has been created to specifically work with dependencies on other Change Notifier providers. Reformat it, and for the create, it is the same signature. It gets a build context and returns a change notifier, which is the scroll attributes provider in our case. So let's code that up. You also need to import it to get the visibility. Now we need to write the update. So here it's also a method which takes a build context, an instance of the dependency like the scroll position provider, and also the previous value of the scroll attributes provider. So that way it has access to the previous value and the current value from another provider, and then you can merge that into the previous instance and create a new one or update it. So I think it'll be more clear when we work on it. So because we want to declare a dependency on the other provider, we need to give types here. So the first type argument will be the dependency, which is the scroll position provider, and then the actual provider, which is the scroll attributes provider. Now let's create the method context, then the instance of the scroll position provider is the current instance. Then the previous instance of scroll attributes provider. So these are passed in automatically, so we just need to work with these two and create an updated scroll attributes provider instance. So that's how the changes are transferred to the other child widgets and rebuilt automatically on the change. So as you can see, the return type is also scroll attributes provider, which is the updated one. So we have return, then the updated scroll attributes provider instance. The way to update would be the previous instance, then dot dot. It is a cascading operator which takes the current instance and then updates it without having the need to create a new one. So here we shouldn't be creating a new one, but we should be updating the existing instance. So that is made possible with the cascading operator here. It gives access to the set method. We set it with the value from the scroll position provider instance. So we'll be using that. Then we do the fetch, which is the get method. It's formatted. That is how you get access to values from other providers and update the previous instance to create an updated version. Now that we have the provider in place, we can now register and access the scroll position attributes data in the child widgets. Now let's go to scroll direction indicator and then subscribe to this new provider to get access to different attributes and then update the UI accordingly. So we're in here. Instead of the scroll position provider, we now access the scroll attributes provider. Let's import that. You can comment this out and update this with the attributes provider. We need to update the get method. So instead of the text, now we'll be having an icon, and the background also will be dynamic based on the attributes that we get from the provider. For the icon, we'll be using the scroll direction icon and the scroll attributes provider, which has the map of scroll attributes. So based on the value, whether it's positive or a negative value, we have the upward arrow or the downward arrow icons. And also we have a size set for the icon. Apart from that, we'll also have colors given to the icon and the background. The primary color for the icon and the background color set to the accent color. So let's get back to the scroll direction widget. So here instead of text, we'll be having an icon. Let's update the scroll position to scroll attributes. The background color, let's set the accent color from the attributes. Since it is a map, we can use the key to get the corresponding value. Similarly for the icon, we'll use the corresponding key for the icon. We go here. In the scroll attributes provider, we have the scroll direction icon size. So give the other attributes. Also, let's make the circle avatar a little bigger. Give it a more radius. It's a double. Let's give it 25. Now let's save it, restart the app, and pull up the emulator to see how it's working in the app. You can already see the initial value with the upward arrow and background and primary colors. So I only have 3 colors as of now in the ScrollAttributesProvider, like blue, amber, and red. But depending on what you want, you can have more finer granularity and more colors to have a smooth transition. So let's get back to the app. Now let's see how it goes with the scroll. So you see the color is getting reflected based on how fast you're going, and also the scroll direction. I'm going down, the arrow is down. If I'm going faster, it's red. It's intermediate speed, it's like amber, and if it's going really slow, it is blue. As you see, it gives the illusion of an animation because the widget is getting rebuilt with each scroll. So it can get janky or stutter because you're doing it more frequently with each scroll. So you have to be mindful when you do the animations in an app, or it can lead to a bad user experience. So I'm just using it to demonstrate how the different providers can be used and how to get input from one provider and use it in another to set some data. So now let's give some message here for each news item based on how the user is scrolling. So let's get back to the Visual Studio Code and the news grid item, because that is where we have the individual grid items. So let's import the new provider, the ScrollAttributesProvider. Now, because we'll be updating some message based on the scroll position, we need to convert it to a stateful widget so that the widget could be rebuilt with each input from the provider. So let's refactor it, Ctrl+Shift+R, so convert to stateful widget. So the conversion is now done. It has created a new state class as well. So in the build method, let's register to the ScrollAttributesProvider to get the list of attributes. Let's name it scroll position attributes. We can use the extension method .watch. Now we can use that information to have a message like in a grid tile bar. So that's part of the grid tile to display some message at the bottom of the tile. And then we can use the information about the message in the attributes from the ScrollAttributesProvider. So in the grid tile, we can add a footer. So it is a widget and it says typically it's a grid tile bar. So let's add that. So here it has attributes like the background color, leading widget, title widget, subtitle widget, trailing, just like we have for the list tile bar, list tile that we saw in the previous code. So we'll be using the same primary color, accent color, and other attributes to set up the information to be displayed here. Styling for the leading icon and the text, which we'll get from the attributes as well. Let's save it. That completes the changes. And also let's restart the app. So you see you have that message at the bottom in the grid tile. Let's give it some padding so that it can match that of the card here. So refactor it, wrap it in padding widget. Let's leave it with the default value. Let's save it, restart it. The app is reloaded. It looks much better now. So let's do the scroll and see how it works. So you see, you have the message being displayed at the bottom based on the speed. So if you're scrolling too fast, it's red. It's somewhere in between, it's yellow, and the normal one is blue. So as you can see, the app, it's kind of janky and it stutters, meaning the movement is not so smooth. So again, that's why you have to be mindful about the animations that you use in your app to find a balance between the user experience and the responsiveness of the app. So that is all in this video about the providers. We saw how to create a provider, multiple instances of the provider, and how to get input from one provider and pass it on to another. It does improve the state management of the app by allowing targeted access to data and targeted rebuilding of widgets rather than the entire widget tree, making it more efficient and keeping the app more responsive. I'll leave links to some relevant resources in the description. In the next video, we'll look at the block pattern, which is a design pattern with the same idea of separating out the business logic, but with more stricter rules. If you found this video helpful, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. So take care, thank you for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.